because he didn't want to intervene in the end in Syria, because he allowed Benghazi to happen, therefore Putin said, now I'm free to do what I want to do. Conveniently forgotten by these critics, of course, is that in 2008, Putin invaded Georgia. George W. Bush was then in the White House, as we all recall. And I thought that what Robert Gates, former defense secretary and Republican, what he said just a week or so ago was quite apt, and I quote, "Putin invaded Georgia when George W. Bush was president. Nobody ever accused George W. Bush of being weak or unwilling to use military force." This is Gates. I think Putin, speaking about the current situation, I think Putin saw an opportunity here and he seized it. So, I would not suggest, and Robert Gates does not suggest, that George W. Bush was a weakling. And in fact, what I want to suggest to you today is that the evidentiary support for the notion that toughness has a deterrent effect on adversaries is really, really slim. I think we have very good evidence now from both political scientists and historians that there is not much evidence for this notion. Sometimes it's referred to as the credibility imperative, that if we don't do X, then our credibility with Y will be shot. I think the research demolishes the widely held view by pundits and politicians that a state that backs down in a crisis or wants to negotiate a political solution in a crisis loses credibility in the next crisis. In fact, I think what the evidence shows by historians and other scholars is that a state's past behavior has almost no effect on how others assess its credibility. So reputation, I want to suggest, is an overblown concept. And what happens in a given country, this is now more the historian in me than the political scientist. We'll see if Matt agrees or disagrees. But each case is fundamentally unique. Because what happens in a given country depends on the particular conditions within that country. So I think we're giving way too much credence to the notion that failure to respond here with respect to Russia in this crisis will necessarily weaken America's credibility with its key allies. One question, for example, that I would have, where else are those allies going to go? Maybe Putin, and here I defer to the experts who are with me on this panel, all four of these people know more about the subject than I do, but maybe Putin acted more out of the sense of his own weakness than his sense of America's supposed weakness. There's no more Soviet Union, after all, for Putin. No more Russian control over areas that the Russian czars and then the communist leadership held for more than 300 years. NATO, meanwhile, is moving ever closer to Putin's own borders. Some commentators over the last few weeks have made these points. I don't mean to suggest that somehow I'm saying something that nobody has said. But what has been striking to me is how often, especially in the punditocracy, how often what we get instead is a kind of fear-mongering, an assessment of stakes that it seems to me is exaggerated, a sense that doom is upon us, and an unwillingness to place the issues here in the kind of historical context that I think my three fellow panelists have done. Second, and brief point concerns this penchant, as I suggested earlier, for historical analogizing. And by the way, I don't mean to suggest, maybe I'll just insert this quickly, I don't mean to suggest that the United States has no stakes in this particular struggle. I do think that it's partly up to the United States to make clear, it seems to me at least, that Russia pays a price for violating international law and the global norm against interstate war. I think there's a global principle at stake, which is whether national boundaries can be changed by brute force. And the U.S. is key. It may be true, as Fareed Zakaria said in his column, I think yesterday, that the United States is on some level the indispensable nation on this particular crisis. is that this crisis might be Putin's Waterloo rather than somehow America's Waterloo. It seems hard for me to believe, and I would love in the discussion to have a discussion about this. It seems to me, it's hard for me to understand at least how Putin comes out of this well, but I stand to be corrected. It seems to me that what this is doing is very damaging to him in very different ways. I think perhaps, again, as the non-specialist here, that in taking over or seeking to take over Crimea, he has effectively lost Ukraine. And that seems to me a very big price to pay. That we should discuss that. Just very quickly on the historical analogizing. Presidents have done this for decades. It's absolutely fascinating to me the degree to which Munich, for example, is invoked, including by Hillary Clinton in this particular crisis, when she said in Los Angeles, I think it was last week, that that what we can see here, what the Nazis were doing in the 1930s, and we can see, and I'm paraphrasing, a sort of parallel. Putin, I want to suggest this afternoon, go out on a limb and say Putin is not Hitler. I don't think he's a fanatic. I think he's a cynical Russian nationalist. He's presiding over a crippled great power, the power that used to be. And I think he's ultimately a realist. That's my sense. And that the challenge that the Nazis presented was an extraordinary challenge that the United States and other countries had to stop at all costs. Nor do I think, and I agree with Matt here, that this, I don't believe that this is really a new Cold War, notwithstanding the title of our session. Leave aside the ideological schism that I think Matt referred to, leave aside the fact that we no longer have the kind of proxy wars that we used to have, the absence of diplomacy that I think characterized much of the Cold War, thankfully is no longer with us. But I'll leave you with one thought, and it might be that in the following way, the Cold War analogy is apt. When the Soviet Union invaded Hungary in 1956, the United States under Dwight Eisenhower did not respond militarily. The same was true in 1968, when the Soviets put down an uprising in Czechoslovakia. Sometimes, perhaps, geography really is destiny. Putin believed, it would seem to me in this case, that its vital interests were at stake in Ukraine and in Crimea, that those vital interests were threatened, and then that it had the means, the will, and the proximity, that's the geography here, the proximity to act on that basis. Maybe we need to acknowledge that fact. I thank you.
So, like Professor Logenwald, I'm eager to pose questions to our panelist specialists, but I know that you are eager as well, and so I feel a sense of responsibility to let you have a try. Here's what I propose for the ground rules. Raise your hand if you have a question. There will be a roving microphone, and if you have, say, a comment rather than a question, please phrase it as a question and do it in a succinct way, and that will be more convincing to us. And also identify if you have a particular panelist in mind who should respond. And if there seem to be lots of questions, I might start grouping them and then ask our panelists to respond at the end. We'll play it by ear. So let's see, who do we have? Please. Okay. Yeah, actually, why don't you keep your hands up for a moment, and so our microphone carrier can notice for the future. Plan ahead. Let's see if it works.
So I know that this wasn't exclusive, part of the topic exclusively, but while you guys are here, I figured I'd ask this. One thing that wasn't really touched upon is the relations with Russia, Ukraine, the EU, and America sort of as a whole. And this wasn't something that was brought up directly, but a lot of EU's energy comes from Russia, and it goes right through Ukraine. So I'm wondering how you guys think that this Crimean episode will
Yeah, as I mentioned before, Europe has balked at imposing sanctions on Russia, in part because of the energy issue. Europe is Russia's biggest market for its energy, and Europe very much feels that. It's also a big trading partner. Russia has been trying for years to get around Ukraine by building the North Sea pipeline, Nord Stream, yeah, sorry, on which Kremlin elites have stolen just inordinate amounts of money. But the Kremlin has already threatened, or Gazprom has already threatened that it's going to shut off gas to Ukraine because they don't see the government as legitimate. So there's already, the usual muscle flexing and fears at play, just to answer that part of it.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a very, very important question that you ask. And Europe has been, in opinion of many experts, myself included, a bit reluctant or slow in developing alternative energy sources. I mean, it's difficult, right? And for Germany, more specifically, Germany was the biggest exporter of Russian gas, it's an important issue. The fact that we see Merkel emerging as a much more assertive woman, we have been expecting her to be a more assertive political leader, but now that she's coming to be more assertive, I think is a bit telling. And we really hope that Europe can move further away in developing their own energy sources, moving away from Russia, but it's a very sticky situation. One of the analysts this morning on NPR said something that made me chuckle as I was getting ready to come here. He said, maybe because the reason that Merkel is getting more assertive is because summer's coming. Right, which it's a funny observation, but nonetheless, the point you're raising is absolutely pivotal in a sense. Yes.
I was so taken with your T-shirt, and I will just tell everybody that I have 2 degrees from the institution. It says yuck fail if anybody didn't say. But I was so taken with that I think I missed the question. Maybe it was already answered.
I was wondering how you think in a more international area, in a more international sense, how you think that the import and exportation of energy, especially in regards to the EU, will be affected in terms of international trade, especially in regards to American exports, which currently there really aren't any. So I'm wondering if you think that will change.
Oh, it's a very good question, and I don't actually have a good answer to you in terms of the implications of this for energy more broadly and for the United States. I don't know. Matt, can you bail me out?
Yeah, I can give a stab. I mean, you mentioned possible exports to Europe from the United States and Norway. The issue is that the natural gas depends on fixed pipelines, and until the Nord Stream pipeline is available to get around these areas of conflict, that's not an option. Oil is much more easily transported. The United States has plans for liquid natural gas that could be sent to Europe, but as I understand it, the technology is not quite there to have that as a solution. So this will be an issue, and it's interesting that you could say that the summer makes Angela Merkel more assertive because there won't be as much dependence on gas. But in the winter, when Russia cuts off gas to Ukraine, it affects those European states. I was living one winter in Italy when he did it, and it actually affects the supply of gas there. So that might make people assertive as well. I think it's a very risky game for the Russians. So there was somebody here who had a question. Yes, please, and then the gentleman there.
This is mainly for Julia. I remember in your article about the loneliness of Vladimir Putin, a specific comment made by somebody that said that they couldn't imagine Russia way into the future in reference to the deteriorating civil conditions. So how much worse do you think things can get now before a really major change happens? Like, what do you see in the near future?
Sure. The question was about how much worse things can get in Russia before change comes. Russia has shown that it can always get worse. And the more optimistic you are about Russia, the more likely you're going to be wrong in your prognosis. If I'm more serious, I think the comment you were referring to was that what people, and Fred said this too, there's not really a narrative that you can imagine for Putin going forward. I mean, how does this end for him, 5 years from now, 10 years from now? And what this person said, he was actually a parliamentary deputy from the ruling party, and he said that, you in the U.S. have this tradition of you serve 2 terms and leave. We don't have this tradition. You fight till the end and you go out feet first in a coffin. Things are getting worse and worse in Russia, and just when you think they can't get worse, another crazy law makes its way through the Duma, or pro-Russian volunteers show up in a neighboring country. I don't know. I think the thing that would have to happen in Russia for things to change would be a prolonged period of economic malaise, because one of the things that was different between Kiev and the protests in Kiev and the protests in Moscow was that Muscovites have a lot to lose. They're a lot richer. A lot of the people who are out protesting have nice cars, and they go on vacations abroad, and they have every product that Apple makes, and they're not really, their feet aren't really held to the fire so much. So I think, and traditionally, I mean, in Russia in the last 100 years, the things that have brought about this kind of big cataclysmic political change has been, years of economic stagnation and malaise. So,
if I can maybe add to this, right? Julia is absolutely right. Economic development is necessary, but for Russia it's particularly difficult because Russia's economy is so incredibly dependent on exports. Russia is not a diversified economy. It's very one-sided. So modernization of economy is pivotal, but then again, can you introduce modernization of economy without modernizing the system? And modernizing the system means a complete rehaul of the entire constitution of the Russian Federation. The Constitution of 1993 is such a remarkable little document that even if you are a benign or even benevolent person, you inevitably will become a dictator. The Constitution gives so much presidential power, capacity to rule by decree, capacity to completely bypass Parliament, capacity to declare war without necessity of the Parliament. That is remarkable stuff. Yeah, so that's
still let me use the prerogative of the chair for a moment. What I found really striking in the remarks here, observing Russian popular opinion, both Julia and Anna mentioned the statistics, is this war has made Putin much more popular than he was. Julia reported very well from Moscow on how unpopular he was a few years ago, and so that's something that I think we need to pay attention to. If it's because we've seen examples like this, and at the risk of offending my historian colleague by using a historical analogy, we've seen situations like this in former Yugoslavia, for example, when Slobodan Milosevic kept provoking conflict, the more unpopular he became at home, and I think it's a risk. I'd be interested if my colleagues think so.
Yeah, I mean, I remember right before the presidential election in Russia in March 2012, all the foreign correspondents in Moscow kind of fanned out across the country to see what the rest of the country thought, because Putin had very clearly lost Moscow to these pro-democracy protests. And what we found pretty unanimously was what one British colleague said was that Putin must be the most passively supported leader in the world. That the system he had created was not designed to make him hugely popular, but was to deprive Russians of an alternative. So a lot of the people I spoke to, my colleagues spoke to across the country, supported Putin, were going to vote for him because they couldn't think of who else they would vote for, and there were no really viable candidates that they could vote for. The other thing they said was, we know he's a crook, we know he's stolen trillions of dollars, and he and his cronies have stolen trillions of dollars, but at least they've been stealing for 12, then it was 12 years, and we hope that maybe their appetite's a little sated. You get new guys in, and they come in fresh and hungry with empty pockets. So it's a pretty cynical support. What you're seeing now is a little different. This is historically Russia has done well with internal political support when there's an external enemy, and that's one of the reasons that in his electoral campaign, Putin started pointing fingers at the West and turning the West into this, and especially really the State Department into this all-powerful boogeyman that ruled events all over the world as a way to rally support for himself.
Just two quick comments on this. I think there are two things in terms of what can really explode in Russia. I think one question, and Julia addressed it in her work as well. There's this generational difference as well, and this attitude of stability is better than bad stability is better than maybe instability, but for better life. There's clearly sort of a very Soviet mentality, and I wonder whether with the generational shift that might fade away in terms of popular perceptions of satisfaction with the state. And the other issue, I think, is that what we've seen in terms of protests, as Julia mentioned, is really what were really middle-class protests. I think what can indeed send Russia down the drain is a kind of bread riots, right? And the thing is, so if the economic situation is deteriorating, if indeed there is zero growth, as Putin has just suggested the other day, any big economic shock, which might not be coming from any external source, might indeed provoke those. So I think the combination of these two things is another element we might be wanting to
I would say that not a shock, but sustaining, because they had quite a massive shock in 2008. GDP growth went from +8% to -8% in a matter of days. And that didn't change anything in Russia. I think it has to be prolonged and really painful. The thing about the generation, I don't really put a lot of stock in the generational divide, because young people have this way of getting older and turning bitter and cynical if things around them don't improve. So the generation that helped topple the Soviet Union in 1991 was young and hopeful then. They're all, in their 50s now, and often voting for Putin. So.
Okay, thanks. I have two people patiently waiting over here, the gentleman in the sweater, and then the one sitting in front of you, Jeff, please.
Yeah, so with over 2 million Agent Orange victims in Vietnam and 3,000 such births just last year receiving municipal compensation, and a 12-year war in Afghanistan, why are you so interested in this subject? Where's the historical analogizer?
I'm going to pair that question with the one from the person in front and then give my panelists the option to answer.
Julia, you stated that you believe that economic sanctions will not be effective when it comes to getting Russia out of Ukraine. What do you believe will be effective?
I agree with Fred on this one, that this is not, I think, especially people in Washington and punditocracy really overstate the U.S. ability to solve this crisis. And especially given that Putin is increasingly a realist less and less, that he is driven by a logic that is completely his own, that we don't really have access to. This is going to be a hard one to solve. I think that I don't think I really don't know. I don't think economic sanctions are going to do it.
Yeah, I guess in response to the first question, I'm at least partly with you if I understood the nature of the thrust of the question, in that I would say that this particular issue is not without security concerns, or at least national interest for the United States, but I would say they're of a fairly modest nature, and that compared to the crises that you mentioned, and the interventions that you mentioned, and of course I've spent much of my career as a researcher writing about the Vietnam case, so that one I'm especially familiar with. No question that I would suggest that this is a lower level of magnitude. I would still say what I suggested earlier, which is it's that there are important principles at stake in this crisis. I do think that the United States has a role to play. I don't think it rises to the level where military intervention or military options are either likely to be successful or, in this case, merited, I guess, if that begins to answer the question.
Well, it's not important to the 2 million Agent Orange victims.
Well, but that's, and with all due respect to them.
This is the ultimate hypocrisy. You're teaching these young people who were all born
Well, I don't think that's correct at all. I think there are many classes on this campus, including ones that I teach, Professor Evangelista and others teach, that are very much focused on what the United States has done historically, including in the very recent past. Professor Evangelista is teaching one right now on the Cold War. But, you know, the suffering in Vietnam, and I would say I bow to nobody in my condemnation of those actions by the United States. I have argued repeatedly that this was an unnecessary war, a war that was not, should not have been fought, and that there are millions of victims, including in the United States. But that doesn't mean, it seems to me, that therefore anything that happens after that is of marginal importance necessarily. You've got to judge each case on its own.
I think it's a very good question. How should the United States set its priorities, and should this issue be a priority for U.S. foreign policy? As it turns out, this event did generate a lot of interest, and there are people who would like to pursue the issue. So I'd like to take some more questions. Yes, please. Yes.
So could you comment on the Budapest Agreement? Is it just an empty document? And should other nations, in particular Iran, take clues out of that?
Excellent question.
Okay, so say what if you want to answer it, say what the Budapest Agreement is.
Right, so the Budapest Agreement of 1994 was signed by Great Britain, United States, and Russia that guaranteed Ukrainian sovereignty and territorial integrity in exchange for Ukraine giving up its nuclear arsenal, which in the 1990s was substantial. And the reason, of course, that these guarantors signed on was to say that Ukraine, you really don't need this enormous arsenal to protect yourself because we will be guaranteeing your safety. What this action shows us that indeed it's a gentleman's agreement, and Putin is no gentleman. Right, I know it's a cynical answer, but yeah, what this means that the implications that you are raising are of phenomenal importance globally. Because as you say, what is now Iran to do if Russia, again, is trying to be one of the guarantors for Iran to say that you give up your nuclear arsenal, or at least attempt to develop one, if we're going to protect you. Russia, in this case, showed itself that such agreements, apparently, are of questionable quality. And it is a tremendous issue for international affairs from this moment on, for nuclear non-proliferation issues altogether.
So it's an excellent question. Did you want to follow up briefly?
So Ukraine has the ability to build arsenal very quickly, right?
Okay, so I wanted to respond to that because it was an excellent question and an excellent answer, but then you might draw the conclusion, well, Ukraine should have kept those nuclear weapons. And this is a position that a graduate of my department, actually, John Mearsheimer, who does a PhD at Cornell, has made. He made it at the time. Ukraine should keep its nuclear weapons, and he made it the other day, I told you so. But as a practical matter, what Ukraine had were Soviet missiles and bombers that it would not have been able to use. They weren't targeted against Russia, for example, which was the likely threat. They had although Ukraine produced missiles itself and had the technical capability and the engineers, it didn't produce the nuclear warheads, and it didn't know how to use them, how to get through the codes, that if you mistakenly try a certain number of times, just make the weapons not work anymore. The other issue is a sort of political issue that I think Mearsheimer and people who believe what he believes don't fully appreciate, that maybe if every country in the world automatically had nuclear weapons, countries would be much more cautious about violating the territorial integrity of others. But it doesn't happen automatically. And even in Ukraine, it wouldn't have happened automatically. There would have been a long transition period where Ukraine resisted the demands of every other country to turn over those weapons, and that would have been a very perilous time. And I could imagine that the things we're fearing now, an invasion of eastern Ukraine, the annexation of Crimea, could have happened in the early 90s. So I think that's something to take into consideration, the transition period.
On the Budapest Memorandum, I think the official position now, or the semi-official position of the UK and the US, is that it did not give the guarantees. The guarantees are only given to NATO members. It gave assurances, and so the official position is that that's what we are doing. We are putting the diplomatic pressure, we're introducing the sanctions, we are prepared to move to the next level of sanctions. So we are trying to help along with the situation. Now, what it raises, though, is the question that's linked to the previous one: where's the red line? Okay. And so I think when we talk about Ukraine, we have to remember that there's the Crimean situation, which is basically, it's a peninsula, it almost looks like an island, and that's already de facto occupied. And it's very difficult to imagine a scenario, whoever does whatever, that it stops being occupied at this point. Russia doesn't recognize those forces, but there's really little that can be done to de-escalate the situation considerably for Kiev to really regain effective control over the territory. So I think what we are risking specifically in Crimea is the same situation that we've been seeing in Transnistria and Moldova for the past 2 decades. It's no man's land and nobody's jurisdiction, and it's already clear that local actors have seized this kind of situation. There has been a local power grab by very dubious personalities who are like, might perform that kind of in the kind of role of a local leader who just runs a strange piece of land in that kind of form. And that obviously is also the situation that probably plays very well into the hands of Russia. Because if you actually admit you're occupying somebody's territories, this country has learned the hard way. I mean, it also comes with costs and responsibilities. You have to provide public order, you have to build infrastructure. Crimea gets 80% of its electricity and water from the mainland. If it gets cut off from Ukraine, Russia has to pump in enormous investment to keep that territory up and running. And so that's the kind of consideration we're not sure Putin is making. I think that kind of status quo, having effectively lost Crimea, is likely to continue, and that's pretty much recognized by the US and the European Union as well, and the government in Kiev. I mean, I think even if it's not the official line, everyone is saying Crimea is gone, there's nothing we can do about it. So that's not the red line and beyond which people, the Western powers are prepared to really act. The red line might be if there is additional military incursion in the territory of Ukraine, meaning the mainland. So that's, I think, again, a kind of, and we don't know if that's going to happen. There's a build-up of military forces outside of Ukraine's borders. But I think that's the kind of distinction we might want to keep in mind here when we're talking specifically about Ukraine.
Okay, thanks. Someone in this direction, yes, please.
So this is primarily for Alright, thank you. This is primarily for Julia. So looking at the pictures, you see a lot of the black and orange Great Patriotic War ribbons, and like there are reports of like everything a lot of World War II patriotic. The orange and black Great Patriotic War ribbons and the songs being played. So is there a sense, I guess, in eastern Ukraine and Crimea, where it's sort of a modern-day extension of World War II in that there's a move to reclaim the Russian-speaking parts for Russia and kind of like from this manufactured fascist regime that they think is in Kiev. So like, is it like a manufactured like extension of the modern-day Great Patriotic War to reclaim those parts for Russia?
No, those flags have become very politicized in Russia. They used to be this, I think they were originally an imperial, part of an imperial medal, and then they became the memorial ribbons for World War II. For those who have never seen them, they're these ribbons that are striped orange and black, and they commemorate World War II. During the protests in Moscow in the winter 2011-2012, the symbol of the protesters was a white ribbon, tied to your bag, pinned to your lapel, to your jacket, and the orange and black ribbon became the ribbon of the people who supported Putin or who were not in favor of the pro-democracy protesters. So this is kind of a spillover of this kind of Kremlin imagery into eastern and southeastern Ukraine, and to me it's more proof that a lot of these guys are being busted and they just come with their own insignia. But yeah, there is this, but aside from that, there is this kind of weird fusion of Soviet mentality and imperialist mentality of cobbling together this larger, excuse me, Russian-speaking universe. Sorry, I'm not going to die at this panel today.
Okay, thank you. Yes, please.
From Georgia, it's especially easy for me to see the similarities to the 2008 war, and I hope things are as peaceful as possible this time. My question is, how powerful is the genuine pro-Russian voice in the Ukraine, and was Yanukovych a representative of that voice, according to the electoral behavior in the last election? Thanks.
Before, just, I want to leave this to you guys, but before Yanukovych was in power, Putin loved dealing with Tymoshenko. So they were both equally pro-Russia leaders. And actually, shortly before Yanukovych fled, Putin started reminiscing at one of his press conferences about how well he had worked with Tymoshenko. And she's seen as, this kind of pro-Western, pro-European leader. These are both kind of old guard leaders who are very cynical and know what they have to do. And to be fair, whatever the arrangement is that comes out of it, Ukraine can't get away from the fact that it's going to have to deal with Russia, its closest neighbor, its biggest trading partner. And I think the Yanukovych, Tymoshenko kind of reflect that tone.
Could you say whether that's true of the current acting Prime Minister and his supporters? Does he also think he has to deal with Russia?
Well, it's interesting if you look at the rhetoric in the days after after Yanukovych fled, what the statements coming out of the Rada and out of the Maidan camp. It was a very conciliatory tone. It was saying that we will respect the rights of Russian language speakers. We want a unified Ukraine. And we want good relations with Moscow. This is not about you guys. That was until Russia non-invaded Crimea. So I think that kind of changed their calculus a bit. But yeah, I mean, they have to deal with them right now too.
For political support of Yanukovych, his election, right, to some degree was a stunning moment. But on the same note, it really wasn't. Because when we arrived at that particular election, there wasn't really much choice. Again, to what Julia was saying about this passive acceptance, right? Again, what was the choice between Tymoshenko and Yanukovych? Right now, the support for Tymoshenko, I think, is the same as it was then, as in, it's time to retire, enough. We've seen what you're capable of. And at this particular moment, you can argue that Yanukovych did win by the tiniest of margins, and how representative his support really is, I think, really was a choice of choosing between two evils. And his particular election, to my mind, is definitely a marginal victory at best. So to say that he's a representative of a large group of population, I think would be a mistake.
Yeah, just a quick remark. I think the difference from the Georgian situation is that, as we, I think, already mentioned several times, that there is a huge difference in Ukraine between Russian-speaking and someone who has a strong pro-Russian identity, implying really a political identification, meaning, I'm prepared under certain circumstances to go and support secession or some form of political unity. And just to give you one example, in Crimea, which is indeed no wonder that the situation has gotten so bad there, which is really the only place in Ukraine where you could show evidence for stronger pro-Russian public opinion. The pro-Russian groups were really, really marginal, and as Julia was saying, they were not even active on the streets right after the revolution in Kiev. And the person who basically performed the power grab in Crimean parliament, proclaiming, as he has with Augustines at the referendum this Sunday, he has won 4 seats in parliament out of 100 seats in Crimean parliament. Crimea has its own parliament, right? So that's 4%. He got in probably using electoral frauds. We don't even know how attainable those results are. So this is really a marginal political identity. If you go by political identity, this is really, really marginal in Ukraine.
But so the action of the guy who was kind of elected by a mob on the street, Russia is now treating as this legitimate politician that it does business with, whereas they will not recognize Yatsenyuk, they will not recognize anybody in Kiev because they were elected by the street and see as illegitimate. So it's this, just getting back to the Budapest Agreement, what you're seeing a little bit is the way Russia works internally, projected outward. That the law is not a framework of protections and rules. It's to be used selectively for punishment or extortion, or to kind of, like in two equal circumstances, you pick the one that's favorable to you and line up the law to kind of justify you. So that's where you're seeing all this weird, warping of logic and fact.
One more thing, if I may add on that subject of the Russian ethnic or linguistic identity, right? We talked about this a little bit before panel, as in what gave this supposed Russian identity. It wasn't necessarily that it was, nobody was killing anybody on Maidan in terms of people killing on Maidan, but there wasn't an address towards Russians, American Russians. There wasn't sort of this influx of, as Kharkov and Donetsk and Crimea were worried that all of a sudden this Bayeviki from Maidan are going to come and start infusing their own law. The point was that what unified them was a mistake from this interim government to revoke the law that lifted Russian language to near national status. Right? Yanukovych passed that law 2 years ago. It was a very iffy law at the same time. It met a lot of resistance in the West. It met a lot of resistance in Kiev. There were hunger strike by students to oppose that law. So the revocation of that law in such an completely awful, impolitic move gave them the spark that ignited all of this. Oh my goodness, our rights are now infringed. We have to learn Ukrainian, and oh my goodness, wouldn't it be horrible?
Okay, we're running short of time, so what I'd like to do is group 3 more questions and then give our panelists a shot at them. So I saw 2 people over here. Yes, Louis, please. And so let me identify you, and then gentleman in the tie here, and then there's a gentleman over here, and I think we're going to have to leave it at that. So thank you for your patience. So,
obviously, we were talking about how Putin pretty much isn't going to leave Russia in anything but a coffin. But how do you think that in a post-Putin Russia, Ukraine and just this general need to be seen as a respectable world superpower, how do you think it will fall on the list of priorities for Russia in general, for any future Russian leaders?
I want to go back to the historical part. I know Poland has played a major role recently in this crisis, and I was wondering what their future role will be right now, maybe influencing Germany and the European Union to take more drastic actions on this. So just thoughts regarding the Polish interaction with them.
Please. Yes. Yes.
Yes, I'd like to know how you think this situation might impact anti-Putin factions within Russia. Will mobilize them, or maybe have the opposite effect?
I can start from that last question. So far it's been crushing them.
Because under the kind of umbrella of mobilizing the country for a non-invasion, Putin has basically decided to clean up at home and closing down news sites, blocking access to internet sites. It's destroying them.
And also accusing academics and non-governmental organizations with any contacts in the West as being traitors, as you were saying earlier. That campaign has revived in the wake of the action in Crimea. Other people on? Anyone on Poland?
I think that's a very good question. I mean, we have seen that Poland has been extremely active in the EU foreign policy in general. I mean, it has to be said that among the new member states of the European Union, Poland is really the new star and the new big player. So it has done tremendous work, and in fact, the association agreement that we started off with, the one that President Yanukovych declined to sign, is part of the initiative, the so-called Eastern Partnership Initiative of the European Union that was launched in 2009 under the proposal of Poland and Sweden. So there's a new alliance within the European Union between Baltic states, Nordic states, and the Visegrad 4 group, Poland is part of it, that's been really driving a major rethink of the European Union neighborhood policy, which basically what happened with the European neighborhood policy was when they completed the latest wave of enlargement, they said we need a policy that would just do something, as we're not really prepared to offer any membership perspectives anymore. Just have something really bureaucratic, functional cooperation, offer all sorts of technical assistance. And Poland was really at the forefront of offering a more political and more strategic kind of policy, and with these kinds of associations agreements and so on. The fact that it didn't quite work the way European Union was hoping, partly because of the really internal domestic dysfunctionalities of these countries, the 6 countries that are involved, as I mentioned, Moldova, Georgia, Armenia, Azerbaijan, and Ukraine, but also, and Belarus, that kind of is a weird appendix to that, but also because of Russian behavior. So I think what is happening now in the European Union foreign policy is that they woke up to the fact that the geopolitics and geostrategy is back at their doorstep, and so they have to really change the way they do foreign policy as this kind of multilateral body. And yes, indeed, Poland is at the forefront of that.
If I, as an interloper, can just offer a comment on this too. Here again, it seems to me that Putin could well come out the loser in all of this. And what I mean by this is, and I stand to be corrected, but it seemed to me that he had marginally better relations, at least compared to where they were before, with several important states, Poland being one of them. Hungary, you could say, was another one. Not maybe great relations, but there was a certain daylight that hadn't been there before. And it seems to me that here, as elsewhere, my sense that it is that in the medium term and long term, he's going to come out the loser.
I think the important caveat there is the loser or winner in what framework. In our framework, yes. In his own logical framework, which is, I don't know, base 12, base 10, if he gets Crimea, even if it's at the cost of losing Ukraine, which he has, he might still be the winner in his own. You
mean beyond what I think several of you have talked about, which is this rallying around the flag effect?
No, in the sense that he wanted Crimea and he got it. Like, I think there, and he rallied people around the flag, so to him, on balance, he might have won. I think our calculus is very different from his.
I agree with Julia in that sense that, again, it depends on calculus. Again, there is a part of us that I think geopolitically, and we said that again when Putin shut off gas once, twice, he went to Georgia, we all said he's going to be a loser. Is he not letting war from tear? How much is this going to really hurt him? Again, perhaps. Geopolitically, he might lose a certain amount of trust. However, again, he gained what he came for, which is Crimea and Peninsula, which again support from over 70% that he didn't have domestically before.
Okay, our event is winding to a close. I would like first to thank the audience for being so attentive and posing such excellent questions, to our organizers for their efforts to get this off the ground so quickly, and for their excellent choice in panelists who are so extraordinarily well informed and interesting. And so I'd like to close by thanking them.